Section 7 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Book 1, Chapter 7. Love or Interest. Dean found his little party drinking their coffee in the Palm Lounge. Lady Olive greeted him with upraised eyebrows. "My dear Stirling," she exclaimed, "have you been telephoning to the other end of the world?" "I'm so sorry," he answered, taking the vacant chair by her side. "I came away from the office feeling that I had forgotten something, and it took me quite a long time to straighten things out. Tell me, what are you all going to do this afternoon?" "We're going down to Ranelagh," said Lady Olive. "There is some tennis, and Dickie is playing polo in the regimental finals. Don't you think that you could take an hour off or so and come down with us? You really look as though you needed some fresh air." Dean shook his head. "Nothing in the world," he declared, "is more impossible. I have an appointment in the city at 3:30 and another at 4. After that I have at least 100 letters to dictate." "I am beginning to discover," Lady Olive remarked, with an air of resignation, "that there are disadvantages in being engaged to a city man." Dean smiled. "Let us hope," said he, "that after you are married you will still regard the situation in the same light. Your friend Julia, for instance, declares that she would never have married anyone who was not kept away from home at regular intervals." Lady Olive leaned a little toward him. After all, he had been very nice. The Elstrees had found him delightful, and there was no man in the lounge so half good-looking. She decided to say something charming. "Julia," she whispered, "was never in love with her husband, even before she married him." "And you?" Dean murmured. She laughed at him and looked away, but he was suddenly insistent, taking her hand and forcing her to turn again toward him. "Tell me," he said quietly, "do you really care for me, Olive? Oh, I know you care enough to justify you in marrying me, but I mean something different. I mean, do you really care in the great fashion, you know, like the people one reads of, Ilsut and Amy Robsart and those?" She looked at him as though he were speaking some foreign language. The earnestness in his face was unmistakable. She answered him with a perplexed little frown upon her forehead. "Ah, I wonder," she murmured. "What a very strange question to ask me, Stirling, just now. Frankly, I don't know. I can only tell you that there is no other man. You are quite alone." The others were all discussing some subject of kindred interest. Dean felt curiously prompted to continue his questioning. His engagement had been such a very matter-of-fact affair. To a certain extent it was understood that he was marrying for position, and she for wealth, and yet in all their conversations they had discreetly concealed the fact. They had told each other that they cared, if not with passion, at least in the most approved manner. There had been no suggestion in their many tête-à-têtes that they were about to embark upon a marriage of convenience. "Tell me," Dean persisted, "if things should go wrong with me, or if you had met me simply as a struggler with my feet upon the early rungs of the ladder, tell me, could you have cared for me then, do you think?" She looked at him curiously. There was something in his face which compelled the truth. "I do not know," she said. "Let me think." "Think by all means," he continued. "Remember that I was introduced to you, even as one of the youngest millionaires. Forgive me if I seem egotistical, but I have a fancy to put things plainly. There is a glamour about wealth. I came to you with that glamour about my name. I am rich, of course, and wealth means power. How much of your affection, Olive, came out to the man, and how much to the millionaire?" "You want me to give you a perfectly honest answer?" she asked. "Absolutely," he assured her. "Don't be afraid of hurting my vanity. I want nothing but the truth." "At first, then," she told him, "nothing to the man and everything to the millionaire. This afternoon," she continued, "I rather fancy that the man has the larger share. You are quite a fascinating person, Stirling, when you choose to make yourself agreeable." "You can't accuse me," he remarked, "of making any special efforts in that direction today." "No," she answered. "You were rather quiet. But still you were yourself. Personally, I am beginning to find something very attractive about a silent man. You speak quite often enough, and what you say is to the point. It seems always to be the pronouncement of the man who knows. You have what Julia calls an air of reserved strength about you, which I fancy that my sex finds a little attractive. Tell me, why all this questioning?" Deane looked away, through the cluster of palms into the little smoking room from which he had issued a few minutes before. "Even the houses," he said, "which according to the injunctions of the Scripture are built upon a rock, are liable to destruction by earthquakes. So even the strongest of us in the city have always the 100th chance of working in the world against us. The most amazing collapses have taken place. I was really wondering what would happen, how greatly it would affect you, if my riches were to vanish into thin air." "What an unpractical person you are this afternoon," she murmured, looking at him curiously. "Suppose I were to sit here and worry about the fit of the dress which Madame Oliver is sending me home this afternoon for the ball tonight. I could make myself miserable in 5 minutes without the shadow of a reason." "Madame Oliver," he declared, "would deserve bankruptcy if she failed to fit a figure like yours." Lady Olive laughed. "Really," she said, "you are becoming quite a courtier." "Dear people," Julia Ram murmured, leaning over, "if we may bring you back to the mundane world, everybody else is dying to start for Ranelagh." Lady Olive made a little grimace, and rose to her feet at once. "Stirling and I have only been boring one another because you all seem so occupied," she declared. "Ranelagh, by all means. It's quite time we made a move." They made their way toward the Pall Mall entrance of the restaurant. Lady Olive fell back once more with Deane. "It's such a nuisance about this wretched dinner tonight," she said. "I think it was very bad taste indeed of the Duchess to ask us without you. You won't forget to come in and see me for half an hour before we go to the ball? I shall be in my room at 11 o'clock punctually, and I will arrange so that I can take you on to Amberley House." He bowed. "I shall be with you." "Where are you dining?" she asked. "At the club, most likely. I never dine out on Wednesdays, if I can help it. We are always so busy. I shall have a quiet, comfortable evening." "Au revoir, then," she said, stepping into one of the 2 automobiles which were waiting. Deane made his adieux to the rest of the party and watched them drive off. Then he called a hansom. "Messrs. Hardaway and Sons, Bedford Row," he told the man. "Drive as quickly as you can." Section 8 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Book 1, Chapter 8. An Awful Responsibility. John Hardaway, although he was a solicitor in a very busy practice, did not keep his friend waiting for a moment. "Come in, Deane, old chap," he said. "Is this business or friendship?" "Mostly business," declared Deane. Hardaway glanced at the clock. 12 minutes precisely," he said. "Fire away, there's a good fellow. You are not going to give me the affairs of the Incorporated Gold Mines Association to look after, I suppose?" "Not I," Deane answered. "They need a more subtle brain than yours. I'm afraid I have come to see you about the other affair." The lawyer nodded. "You heard the result?" he asked. "We did what we could." "Perhaps," Deane answered. "The only thing is that you did not do enough. I'm perfectly convinced, Hardaway, that the man did not go there with the intention of murdering Sinclair." "The evidence," Hardaway remarked, "was exceedingly awkward." "Do you think," Deane asked, "that there is any chance of a reprieve?" "As things stand at present," said Hardaway, "I'm afraid not." Deane, for the first time, sat down. With frowning face he seemed to be engaged in a deliberate study of the pattern of the carpet. "Hardaway," he said finally, "I want to ask you a question in criminal law." The lawyer laughed dryly. "Not on your own account, I hope." "You can call it curiosity or whatever you like," Deane answered. "The only point is that I want you to answer me a question and forget that I have ever asked it you. Your lawyer is like your confessor, isn't he? Your lawyer and your doctor?" "He should be," Hardaway answered gravely. "Then here goes," Deane said. I put a case to you. I mention no names. You can imagine, if you like, that I am writing a novel. A man is tried for murder, and he is sentenced to be hanged. All the time there has been watching this case, listening to every word of the evidence, a person who knows quite as much of it as the prisoner himself. Someone who, if it had been possible, could have gone into the witness box and could very likely have induced the jury to have reduced the charge from murder to manslaughter. Never mind the reasons which made the man hold his tongue. Consider only the fact that he did hold his peace, believing in his heart that it was not possible on the evidence which was submitted for the man to be sentenced. As it happened, the case for the prosecution was worked up with almost diabolical cleverness, and the prisoner was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to be hanged. What can this person do to save his life? The trial is closed. It is too late for him to offer himself as a witness. Hardaway nodded. I understand, he said. The procedure is very simple. He should go to the solicitors for the defense, and they will communicate with the Home Secretary. The case cannot be reopened? Deane asked. No, answered Hardaway, with a shake of the head. Our criminal law has many anomalies. The only thing that could happen in the prisoner's favor would be that if this favorable evidence were convincing enough, the prisoner might be granted a free pardon, and the facts made known through the press. Anything more I can tell you? Nothing, Deane answered, rising. Many thanks, old fellow. You have told me just what I want to know. 6 and 8 pence, please, Hardaway remarked, holding out his hand. Deane laughed and shook his head. I shan't pay, he declared. You can run it in with the other account, or I'll stand you a dinner when and where you please. A dinner and a box at the Alhambra, if you like. Hardaway smiled. We can't run our office on such clients as you, he remarked, pressing the bell. You should never try to fleece your friends, Deane said. Referring for one moment to the other affair, began Hardaway. Well? The only real chance of a reprieve that I can see, Hardaway continued, is on account of the fellow's health. I believe he is really very much worse than he appears, and I fancy that if we had a medical examination it would give us at least a chance. The trouble is that he really seems quite indifferent. Are you thinking of trying to see him, Deane? Deane shook his head. No, he said. I'm afraid I must not do that. There are reasons why I dare not let my name be associated in any way with this affair. They may come out later on, but just at present I would rather not tell even you what they are. By the by, has anyone representing the dead man turned up at all? I mean, has anyone claimed his effects? No one, the lawyer answered. From what I can learn, they are very insignificant. Deane nodded. Can I rely upon you, he asked, to let me know at once if anyone should come forward to claim them? By all means, Hardaway answered. Deane went out into the street and stood there for a few moments a little aimlessly. Then he called a cab and was driven to his offices, a great block of buildings like a bank, situated in a small court off Throgmorton Street. He passed through the outer offices slowly, asking several questions and shaking hands with one or two acquaintances. When at last he reached the inner room, his own sanctum, he turned out his secretary ruthlessly and locked the door. He sat in his leather chair in front of the open table, covered with letters and books of reference. It was before this table that he had built up the fortunes of the great corporation at whose head he was. He sat there now, erect in his chair, with his hands outstretched on the table before him, his eyes looking through that frosted panes of glass opposite. Was there any compromise, he asked himself, any possible compromise? Again he was looking into the gloomy court. Again he saw the white face of the man who so short time ago had sat in this very room, only a few feet away, and had begged so hard for his chance. The whole scene came flashing back to Deane as he sat there. How much blame, after all, was his? He had not suggested violence. He refused to admit that it had entered into his head. Yet he had known what manner of men these two were. He had known, and their meeting had been all his making. Never in this world would he be able to escape from the responsibility of it. Never in this world would he be able to hear those awful words without a sense of real and personal guilt. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul. End of section 8.